A Russian drone attack on Poland was deliberate, targeted, almost certainly long planned, and shows Vladimir Putin is laughing at Donald Trump's haphazard gambits to end the war in Ukraine. That is the verdict of NATO, as Poland's Prime Minister warns we are closer now to open conflict than at any time since World War II. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. And it's all about the Russian strikes on Poland. We're going to look at two things today: what happened and why it happened. First of all, what happened? On the night of the 9th to the 10th of September, some 19 one-way, long-range Russian attack drones crossed into Polish airspace. 4 of them were shot down by Dutch F-35 fighter jets. It triggered a significant military NATO response. Polish F-16s, an Italian AWACS, that's an airborne early warning and control aircraft, was scrambled, and German Patriot missile batteries stationed near the border were put on high alert. The wreckage of 10 of those drones have now been recovered, according to Polish officials. They hit in a number of areas, but most significantly, at least one travelled about 150 miles inside Polish territory and crashed southwest of Poland's capital, Warsaw. The message from that is clear, that the Polish capital is within range of these weapons. No one was hurt, some property was damaged. It appears that these drones were what Ukraine would call decoys. In the nightly bombardments, where we've seen Russia sending hundreds, up to 800 of these Shahed-style attack drones, often a number of them are not armed. They are there simply to overwhelm, confuse and distract Ukraine's air defences. And in some senses, that is what we saw in Poland, because whilst 4 were shot down, we've seen Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz say that that was a good response, but not good enough. And Poland has requested from its allies more help to bolster its air defences. It already has some support. Those Dutch F-35s are part of a NATO policing mission, air policing mission. The German Patriot batteries are part of a rotating NATO contribution to Rzeszów in eastern Poland to bolster its air defences. Now, some suggestions that these drones flew along roads and deliberately passed radar installations to try and test them, and that may touch on the why in a second. We know that when military radars are forced to switch from sort of passive mode into war mode, into conflict mode, that allows the enemy, the other side of that equation, to gather very valuable intelligence about how they operate. And that's why, for example, we've seen throughout this conflict British and NATO, or British and American Rivet joint spy planes patrolling the Black Sea, because they can hoover up signals intelligence about the electronic warfare capabilities of Russian air defense batteries and indeed Russian electronic offensive capabilities as well. Subsequent to the attack, whilst we're still on the what happened, we're looking at the reaction. Poland announced a huge incursion of Russian drones. It was widely condemned. Britain, among the first nations to describe it as an attack. Both the Prime Minister and Defence Secretary John Healey called it an attack. A lot of other countries, including NATO, describing it as an airspace violation. But we have now seen Poland's presidential spokesperson today describing this as an act of armed aggression. One of the first things Poland did once the military operation to defeat these drones was over is they invoked NATO's Article 4. Now, that is one step below the threshold of all-out war, which would be invoking NATO's Article 5. Article 5 is collective defence, which states NATO members see an attack on one as an attack on all. Article 4 allows any NATO member, when they feel threatened, whether it's their territory, their sovereignty, or their political independence is threatened, they can convene the entire alliance for a formal discussion about how to manage that threat. And the Atlantic Council did meet hours after this incursion. We've also seen the European Union Defence Commissioner call for a drone wall, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute in terms of the responses we're seeing to drones, because it has been pointed out that the missiles the F-35s would have used to shoot down those drones might have cost about £1 million each. They're shooting down drones that cost in the tens of thousands, and in conflicts like this, in wars of attrition, balancing the cost of defence versus attack is absolutely key if it's to be sustainable. We've also heard from Poland's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Radek Sikorski, who is a plain-speaking, clear-eyed politician about the threat from Russia. And he said that these drones did not veer off course. They were deliberately targeted. That is very important because the misinformation that Russia has been trying to spread in the wake of these attacks, they didn't deny that they were Russian drones, but they said that they had no targets inside Poland. And they were suggesting two things. As always with Russian disinformation, you often see competing and conflicting narratives just trying to muddy and confuse populations around the world. One of their narratives suggested that these drones might have been steered or veered off course by Ukraine's electronic warfare, by its defences, and other suggestions from Russia suggesting that this was actually a Ukrainian attack, a Ukrainian provocation. Radek Sikorski dismissing that, saying that lies and denials are the default Soviet response. That brings us on to why did this happen? Well, Vladimir Putin is stretching and testing NATO. This is a provocation on the cusp of war. This could, were NATO so minded, be interpreted as an act of armed aggression against one member. That is the trigger for an Article 5 conflict. I spoke to NATO generals and senior defence sources who used phrases like skip in his step, that Putin has a skip in his step since he's had these back-to-back red carpet meetings where he's been feted by Donald Trump in Alaska, by President Xi Jinping in Beijing. And this isn't an escalation out of nowhere. We've seen in the last few weeks, that's those strikes in Kyiv that damaged the British Council. I was there last week with Britain's Defence Secretary John Healey. And of course, it damaged the European Union headquarters and the apartment buildings used by EU diplomats. And then after that, when there was no significant response from either Europe or NATO, we saw an attack against Ukrainian government buildings set ablaze in Kyiv. The first time that a government building like that, right in the centre of Kyiv, had been targeted. These were escalations. What does Putin want to do? Well, he wants to sow division and make NATO look weak, because I think in the Kremlin's mind, if NATO looks weak, then Ukraine will despair and America is more likely to walk away, because Donald Trump, in his own words, does not like to support losers. This creates a dilemma for NATO on how they respond. There will be division, there will be discussion between those who are on the hawkish side and those who are more dovish. But if NATO does nothing, it looks like a paper tiger, and Vladimir Putin appears untouchable to his new Tyrants Club friends, President Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, and the dictator fest that he was part of recently in China. If NATO dithers, it looks weak. NATO has called for, and Poland has called for, a significant effort to bolster air defences in Poland, and that EU Defence Commissioner calling for a drone wall right across the eastern flank, and calls to ramp up support for Ukraine. Now, on that drone wall, it's interesting that today the United Kingdom has unveiled plans for a Shahed killer, a special drone interceptor designed specifically to shoot down the very type of drones that hit Poland and those very same drones which hammer Ukraine every single night. This is known as Project Octopus, and the UK has said that it is a result of a tech-sharing agreement with Ukraine that's going to allow Britain to mass-produce drones for Ukraine. So it's taking the technology and the lessons that are being hard-learned on the battlefield, bringing them to the safety of the United Kingdom, adding in the ability, the sort of technological expertise that exists here to manufacture high tech and at speed. But crucially, these weapons will cost a tenth of those Shahed drones. So estimates for the current production cost of a Shahed drone between $35,000 and $50,000 US. Therefore, whilst it hasn't been announced, we can assume that these Octopus interceptor drones are going to cost between $3,500 and $5,000. And the UK has promised to manufacture thousands of them a month to try and counter and neuter that threat from the Shaheds. A couple of other things to talk about today. Ukraine's GUR, military intelligence, has released more footage of a successful drone strike on a Russian warship. What's interesting is they no longer appear to be going for those seaborne attacks where they hit the hull, almost like sort of jet ski torpedoes that sink the vessels. This was an airborne drone and it hit the radar installation on the top of a vessel. And this was near Novorossiysk, right at the eastern edge of the Black Sea. That's important because that's where Russia's Black Sea fleet has retreated to over the course of this conflict. So a smaller strike by an airborne drone, but targeted, hitting the air defences, the radar and signal sort of monitoring equipment on that vessel. And GUR said that that vessel's role was to protect the rest of the Russian fleet. So clearly, if Ukraine can effectively blind that vessel, it leaves all of the other vessels potentially more vulnerable. And one other thing before we get on to questions today is the news that a Russian businessman, this time Alexei Sinitsyn, who was 49 years old and was the general director of K Potash, has been found dead, apparently beheaded in the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. Now, this is the latest suspicious death of senior Russian businessman. Russian officials, according to the Moscow Times, security officials reporting this death as suicide, even though he appears to have been decapitated. Those two things, as you well know, do not appear to be compatible. But this makes a change from the Russian businessmen who invariably fall out of windows when they fall foul of the Kremlin. And I say thank you to Jake Bro on Twitter, who's directed me to what he describes as one of his favourite Wikipedia pages, which is suspicious Russian-related deaths since 2022, of which this is the latest. And by my count, there are now 81 suspicious Russian deaths like this since 2022. As ever, if you have any questions, please do ask them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. I'll get into the comments or I will answer them on next week's show. We've got a few to get through today. Why doesn't Ukraine send unarmed drones over Moscow to make the population anxious? There's sort of two reasons for this. One is that it is not Ukraine's goal to make Russia's population anxious. Ukraine has sort of tried very hard not to target civilian populations, but to focus on legitimate military targets. And second, and perhaps more importantly, is that Ukraine doesn't need to send unarmed drones over Moscow because it's sending armed drones to targets in, around and beyond Moscow. And that is having an effect on the civilian population. Partly that's because sometimes there are attacks near civilian areas, but more significantly, that's closing Russian airports, causing travel chaos. It's hitting Russian rail lines, causing travel problems. And as we've talked about many, many times, they're hitting the oil refineries and the oil storage sites. They hit an oil pipeline recently, all of which is limiting the supply and driving up the prices of petrol for people in Russia. Question number 2, what is the likelihood of Ukraine being able to take and hold Crimea, take back and hold Crimea? I'm going to say the chances at this stage in the conflict feel very slim. That may sound like sacrilege to people in Ukraine, and certainly to people who've set that as a goal. Ostensibly, it remains Kyiv's ambition to retake all of its sovereign territory, to return itself to its 1991 independence borders. But I think there is an unspoken, or at least not spoken in public, acceptance that that is going to be impossible, if not extraordinarily difficult, the way the conflict has developed. Question number 3, could the attack on the British Council that we've already talked about in Kyiv could the British Council be classed as British territory, and therefore could that be seen as an attack on Britain, and would that trigger an Article 5 sort of escalation? The first point is the British Council building is not an embassy. It does not come under the Vienna Convention. It is not sovereign territory like embassies are. So the short answer is no. Even if it were, God forbid, were the British Embassy to be hit, whilst that would be a massive escalation, it would not necessarily be an automatic trigger for an Article 5 conflict for war. I mean, just as these strikes against Poland, which are clearly an armed attack on a NATO nation, are not necessarily going to trigger a full armed response. We saw, for example, an American strike, I think from memory, during the Kosovo campaign, which hit the Chinese embassy, I think in Sarajevo. Forgive me if I'm getting the details slightly wrong. It was a significant flashpoint, very heightened tensions. Subsequently, we've learned from historical records, I think it was the Americans believed that the Chinese were relaying signals and therefore it was a legitimate military target, but nonetheless it didn't, thankfully, trigger an all-out conflict between NATO and China. Final question, could 2 or 3 nations, were they to resist Russia, were they to put their troops into Ukraine unilaterally or bilaterally or trilaterally if it was 2 to 3 nations? I think it depends which countries they are. This, of course, is on the back of those discussions we've had about the coalition of the willing, being ready to send in a peacekeeping force. I think it's highly unlikely that force will ever go in as a peacekeeping force because Russia will never accept it in that role. And whilst this is not being spoken about publicly, no one is admitting this, it would be almost impossible to evolve those plans as far as they have got without perhaps considering how these same countries that are willing to contribute troops might also be willing to contribute them under different circumstances. And that's why we saw that response from Putin saying they would be legitimate targets. And I think perhaps that's also why we're seeing all these escalatory steps that we've talked about today, the attacks on the British Council, the EU, and most significantly those attacks in Poland. Putin is trying to make the West back off. As ever, thank you very much for watching. If you do have any questions, please do ask them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time.